Welcome to En Route to Success, where we have raw, vulnerable conversations between Fitz DeSanto, Sam Boyer, and many talented individuals, unraveling the truths and principles of people's experiences, methods to grow, and discovering how to live a fulfilling lifestyle. Buckle up, the journey begins now.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to our podcast. Happy day to you guys. How are you guys doing? How are you, Sam?
I'm well, Fitz. Yourself?
Good. Thank you. Hey, I'm really excited because we both agreed on this first episode being vulnerable, being the title. This, I know for sure that we both practice every day. And I'm excited to get into it because it's something that I would say a lot of times people have a hard time to be vulnerable within themselves in front of others. And I'd like for us to share our experience and what we've learned on what it really means to offer a different perspective with others that can use that for themselves. What do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because, like you said, we try to practice it daily, and it is hard for a lot of people. And I often think that you see in today's world, and I've heard this from other people as well, that 30, 40, 50 years ago, it was innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah.
And now it's almost reverse, where it's guilty until you can prove yourself innocent in regards to building trust. And a huge part of that is vulnerability. So yeah, there's a lot we're able to talk about here, but I'm excited.
Yeah, I mean, you really touch a good point there, Sam. Let's get to it. So what I'd like to do is let's ping pong different meanings of vulnerability between us. And we could do at least maybe 3 or 4, and we could go from there. What do you say?
Perfect. Let's do it.
Let's make it fun. So I'll start with 1. Admitting I don't know and standing up for myself.
I like that a lot. I kept mine short, so we're going to have to dive into them. So we're going to say my first point is an aspect of willingness.
Nice. Taking a risk by exposing your emotions.
Being honest.
That's good. Letting go of ego.
Being value-centered.
That's good. I like that. So let's peel it off. Let's try to unravel it, just like what we said right in our intro. Admitting I don't know and standing up for myself. What I mean by that is you really have to dig deep within you to admit that, because one, there's aspect of fear and judgment, especially when you stand up for yourself. Whether it would be a one-on-one or a group setting, you have to be really vulnerable to do that and willing to do so. So that's what I mean by that.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, there's a big portion of admitting you don't know.
Yes.
It's hard to do.
Yes. It kind of ties into the last one, right? Like letting go of the ego. But that's something that really what resonates to me when I think about how to be vulnerable. What did you say the second on you, Sam?
Yeah, my first point was being willing. And the reason I started there is to understand for myself what it means to be vulnerable. There has to be that willingness or a desire to be vulnerable. Because if there's no reason to be vulnerable, odds are no one will be. Because for myself, I looked up the dictionary definition to understand what on paper it means. And to be vulnerable is to be susceptible to physical or emotional attack or harm.
Yep.
So to be vulnerable sounds like a really bad thing right off the bat.
Absolutely. But in reality, yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's just saying we're automatically putting ourselves in a situation to be susceptible to any type of harm on purpose.
Mhm. Yeah. I think in reality, really what it is also it takes to be really brave to be vulnerable, right? As you practice it every day. Um, and like you said, it almost, for me, when you said that, what I thought of is eliminating your fear and really giving hope for you. Um, like acknowledging that hope and eliminating fear at the same time, if that makes sense, right?
Definitely
So,
makes sense.
and that ties into my third one, taking a risk by exposing your emotions. Because what do we do when we become vulnerable in front of people or within just ourselves? It's either we go to self-sabotage or we go to a fear of judgment on others. So that's why I said taking a risk by exposing your emotions, because one way or the other, you are exposing that emotion that you have to dig deep. That was already hard in the first place. So does that make sense?
Yeah. No, you're pulling up something that was already a challenge, and now you're displaying it to one or more people that are now susceptible to the attack or harm, which could be judgment.
Right. And who wants that, right? But at, at the same time, I'm sure it's tied into your next one.
Absolutely, which is being honest. And I kept mine simple because I wanted to elaborate on them.
Yeah.
But when I feel we're being honest, especially in regards to vulnerability, I think it provides clarity to who we're being vulnerable with. Because if you think about the visual that I put in my mind is you're in a group that's potentially hostile and you don't know who's on your side or who isn't, and everyone has swords and you've got swords in each hand and you're kind of pointing them and defending yourself in every direction. Well, to be vulnerable would be to physically lay those swords down, to then hopefully just have a conversation without the weaponry up.
Absolutely. It's almost like we are built to have a self-preservation, but then taking your armor out in front of, whether it would be by yourself or in front of others. So I want to address that you could also be vulnerable by yourself because of letting go of judgment on your own self. Because I could tell you, I'm the worst critic. I mean, Sam, you know this, going through this podcast, I'm always going back to you and asking you like, hey, Sam, how did we do on that? Is that okay? So like for me to really ties into that vulnerability, I have to be okay with it. And that's me saying it's enough, right? So no, I mean, and part of that is letting go of that ego, the last example I said, because when we dial up on our ego, it comes with a fear of judgment and exposure, because now your ego is very high and now you're worried about people's judgment, right? You have to be okay that this is enough. It doesn't matter if, it doesn't matter what it is. You belong where you're supposed to be. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I like to dive in a lot, huh?
We do. This is what happens. No, I mean, being understanding that you are where you're supposed to be, like you just said, and that moment might take some vulnerability of accepting that you haven't quite got to maybe a space, like let's say it's in a relationship and you're having a conversation, a crucial conversation that really takes a lot of vulnerability in that moment. Maybe with yourself, you're not emotionally where you feel you want to be. So then you also have to be vulnerable with yourself in that moment and with the other person who you're having the conversation with. So it's, there's a whole other level of dropping your ego for yourself, but also being accepting of yourself that you're where you're supposed to be because you're on that journey of growth. So
yeah, absolutely. Hey, those are such good pointers, and I like those examples, and Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Sam, because this is where all the fun is. I do want to get for our listeners to have examples of our vulnerability in relates to an everyday life. So if we could ping pong a little bit of examples, between you and I of what I've seen really within my lifetime on really what resonates to me and to others that says, wow, this person's being vulnerable, or me myself, right? So one of the example that I like to that I seem to be practicing a lot being vulnerable with people is making the first move in line of communication. I don't like to do the whole dance thing. I did the last time, I have to do, like he has to do the second time, like for me, I'm being vulnerable, I'm going to communicate with you.
Yeah. I mean,
So
that in itself, because what happens if the other person doesn't respond, right?
right, exactly. So that's an example. What's yours? Tell me.
Yeah. So I think touching on the third point that I said about being value centered, and I think that is kind of the filter with which we make decisions, is having our core values in place.
Yeah.
It's not always about being, I think people hear that and they might think, oh, it's about being perfect, but no one, myself included especially, is not perfect. And I think it's more about those intentions behind it. So for instance, the example that I have is when I started really producing content on LinkedIn.
Wow. Yeah.
And putting myself out there in videos, making posts, sharing my values, my beliefs, what I'm working on, and coming from a space where I was not a big social media advocate, I would say, and then understanding the value behind the growth that can come from producing content and working on personal development and that whole space, that was a huge vulnerability. I remember the anxiety that I had when I recorded my first video. It took me like 3 tries, and it was about fear. And I hope no one goes on my LinkedIn and
No,
searches
you
back
guys
to
should
watch
go.
this.
You guys should go because it's good. I like Sam's content.
I don't know if you have yourself seen this one, Fitz, the original, but that I remember that day of thinking about posting. And then when I finally hit it and I saw loading, processing, I was like, well, now it's out there. I can't do anything about it. But that was just a really vulnerable situation for me. And I think because I did that, I experienced so much growth being consistent with the content over time. And that's just a really big opportunity that I was thankful I was vulnerable in.
Yeah, I mean, it really does take practice, right? The more you practice it, the more you get good at it. It's almost like that old saying that practice makes perfect. When you're vulnerable in your everyday lives, it almost becomes normal, and that's totally okay, right? It's funny because one of my example is sweaty hands before presenting, because I try to be like, so I'm not even gonna touch base on that because you completely explained the whole thing of what that meant. But on a lighter note, I wanted to touch base. I wanted to touch on a vulnerability on a happy note, which is a surprise flash mob dance, right? Like a flash mob. So because all these people, they have to embrace those taking risks of presenting on a flash mob with completely doing a different movement or completely foreign to others, but they're doing their own thing. That's why I have a huge I look up to a lot of dancers because it's so expressive, especially on that type of flash mob dance, right? So I think
That's a great example.
Right. I mean,
I hadn't even thought of that.
it just kind of it dawned on me. I was like, yeah, I mean, growing up as a dancer, for me to get on that stage, you have to be really, otherwise it's going to resonate and they're going to see like they're not having fun. It's like it's technical. So we have to be able to have that letting go of that exposure that, hey, if I mess up, I messed up, so I think, and that's okay. It's going to be a different day tomorrow, so that's one of the things that that I have in my example. What's your next example, Sam?
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate the positive note with that one too. That's I hadn't even thought
Oh,
about
don't worry.
that.
Don't worry. The next one will be for me. The next
Other
example,
end,
we might deep down a little bit.
other end of the spectrum. Well, the one that I had around when I was thinking about being honest as well, the example that came to mind for me is being open with like coworkers or friends or families when you're not at 100%.
Sure.
And that can be a vulnerable situation, especially in like putting that in a professional space, like, hey, like I'm here, everyone's got personal stuff going on in their life, but if something really did happen and you have to be at work or you have to be on a meeting or, working on a project that's got a deadline and you're not 100%, being honest about that. So that way no one's guessing or throwing something your way that they could take care of one day because you're in a bad situation and you work as a team. So, or within a family, sometimes people just have bad days. And if you've got friends that you're, planning on doing something with, and then you're not 100%, like being honest about that so people can actually help was the thought process I had.
No, absolutely. And to be quite honest, how many times have we canceled, right? As long as we're both honest and like, you know what, Sam, I really had a long day. I can't talk right now. Let's do it the next few days or something, So but for me, like I appreciate that even more, right? And it just tells you there's a lot of things that flourish being vulnerable because it definitely have more positive to it than negative on my experience being in front of people and being vulnerable with them, because you get to know more towards the relationship, your friendship flourish more because now you have this understanding. So yeah, I know we're doing good with time. I do want to say, so for the next one, my question is, how do you think we apply being vulnerable in our everyday lives? I can let you go on that first, and I'll toss it on to you.
Yeah. Well, I think you said it earlier in a really good way, is by first being vulnerable with ourselves. And for me, what that looks like is, I'm a pretty goal driven person. That's where
I know.
you and I both, I know. And that's kind of how I gauge a lot of the daily progress that I make towards certain things. So if I don't hit goals a certain day or life happens and I don't follow through on what I said I was going to follow through on, from a self-image standpoint, that could completely destroy me if I'm totally basing my, self-worth, my value off of that.
Yeah.
Being vulnerable to me right off the bat is being honest about, okay, was this a situation that I didn't know was going to happen? And because of that, I didn't hit a goal or two. That's okay. And so that first level of vulnerability is that self level for me. And then beyond that, having honest conversations with coworkers or, people you're discussing with, family and friends, that is just totally where I think it applies on a daily basis. Because, if someone's asking for something at work that you need to get done and you can't do it, or you're behind, or you've got other stuff on your plate that they don't know about, and you don't share that with them, that's being unclear to them. And so I kind of go back to the being clear is kind, being unclear is unkind.
Absolutely.
The idea is to be kind. You definitely need to be clear about that. And that's a whole other level of vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just so many things to that, right? And I appreciate that story, Sam, because it really define how you manage everyday lives, not in a bad way with vulnerability, but it's more so of embracing it to make it really positive for you and towards others, right? So what I mean by that is, for me, like, vulnerability every day is recognizing and owning that I don't know everything. Simple, right? Obviously, I'm willing to share what I know, but being vulnerable to me leads to trust to myself, trust towards others, and other good things that comes with it. So when we're not vulnerable, we can't engage or contribute to anything. That's the way I see it, right? We have to show up to really care. You can't fake caring for the most part.
Right.
Otherwise, it's going to look really fake, right? So, that's, in closing out, that's my takeaway, right? And I know that there's so many layers of vulnerability, and I'm sure we're going to have more parts of it later on, but thank you, Sam, for sharing all that thoughts and in closing out. And I had a really great time with this interactive game.
Yeah, I like this is the new ping pong, I guess.
Yeah, the new ping pong of the podcast. But yeah, I mean, before we close out, go ahead and let our listeners know when they could contact us, and if they want any shout outs or to keep in touch with us.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the most important parts of our podcast here. Definitely, you can contact us directly at our email, alohafitzsam@gmail.com, or individually at Fitz DeSanto on LinkedIn, or Sam Boyer on LinkedIn as well. And then we also have our Instagram page, which will have a lot more coming soon, and that is En Route to Success 365. And make sure to contact us and let us know any topics that you guys want to hear as well. That was another thing I think is important, as well as what you thought and, any other
Feedback.
potential things you want to let us know. So
yeah,
with that,
absolutely. Thank you, Sam. We always end our podcast with our things to be grateful for. What's yours today?
today is rest in the form of naps.
Nice. Why? How many times did you nap today?
Just once, but it was very necessary, and I felt like a new human being afterwards. So
Did you feel recharged right after?
very recharged.
That's important. Today for me is grateful for time, just the value of time, and recognizing that this is what we have and what we wanted to do during this time. Really, for me, we're always caught up in a schedule where we have to do this and do that. For me today, I really made sure that time is essential and have the time to engage in what you wanted to do. So that's grateful. That's what I'm grateful for today. And remember, guys, even small victory is always worth to be grateful for. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Take care.